ever wondered how medieval couples escaped unhappy marriages? Did kings and queens just get divorced whenever they wanted? Could a simple peasant break their marital bonds? The truth about medieval marriage annulments will leave you shocked. Number 7. Consanguinity. When your spouse was actually your cousin. Have you ever found out you related to someone you know? Imagine discovering that person was your spouse. In the Middle Ages, this was actually one of the most common reasons nobles sought annulments. The Church prohibited marriage between people who were related up to the 7th degree of consanguinity. This meant if you and your spouse shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent, your marriage could be declared invalid. King Philip II of France used this excuse when he wanted to end his marriage to Ingeborg of Denmark in 1193. The day after their wedding, Philip decided he couldn't stand Ingeborg and claimed they were too closely related. Conveniently, nobles kept detailed family trees specifically for this purpose. The funny thing, almost all noble families were related if you looked back far enough, making this the perfect loophole for those who could afford to trace their lineage. The Church eventually realized this rule was being abused, and in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council reduced the prohibited degrees from 7 to 4. Still, this remained a popular escape hatch for unhappy aristocratic couples. Peasants rarely used consanguinity as grounds for annulment, not because they weren't related to their spouses, but because they couldn't afford to research or prove the connection. What's particularly fascinating is that the same noble families who used consanguinity to break unwanted marriages would deliberately arrange marriages between cousins when it suited their political purposes. Then they'd just get papal dispensations allowing these technically forbidden unions. Talk about having your wedding cake and eating it too. Number 6. Pre-contract. When you were already engaged to someone else. Did you know that in medieval times, being engaged could be almost as binding as being married? A pre-contract or prior engagement to another person was serious business and could invalidate a subsequent marriage. This wasn't like modern engagements where you can break it off with an awkward conversation and maybe return a ring. Catherine of Aragon's marriage to Henry VIII faced this very challenge. Henry claimed Catherine's previous marriage to his brother Arthur meant her marriage to Henry was invalid all along. But the pre-contract issue went far beyond royal circles. In village communities, verbal promises to marry made in front of witnesses were considered legally binding. If John promised to marry Mary in front of friends at the local alehouse, then turned around and married Jane the next month, Mary could potentially have John's marriage to Jane annulled by proving the pre-contract existed. Church courts took these cases very seriously, and villagers would bring witnesses who had heard the marriage promises being exchanged. Women especially used pre-contract claims to defend their honor when men promised marriage in exchange for sexual favors, then married someone else. Some clever individuals even deliberately created pre-contracts as insurance policies against unwanted arranged marriages their parents might force on them later. The challenge, of course, was proving a pre-contract existed. Without written agreements, these cases often came down to he said, she said testimony. Wealthier individuals might have had written betrothal contracts, making their cases easier to prove. For everyone else, the credibility of witnesses could make or break a pre-contract claim. Number 5. Impotence. When the marriage couldn't be consummated. Can you imagine having your sexual abilities questioned in a public church court? That's exactly what happened in medieval impotence cases. Sexual consummation was considered essential to a valid marriage, and failure to perform could be grounds for annulment These cases created some of the most embarrassing court proceedings in medieval history. The accused husband might be examined by court-appointed midwives or physicians to determine if his equipment was functioning properly. In some regions, couples were even subjected to the humiliating Congress test, where they were required to attempt intercourse in the presence of witnesses, usually behind a curtain, but still. Women seeking annulments on grounds of impotence needed to be virgins, which was verified through physical examination. If the wife wasn't a virgin, the court assumed the marriage had been consummated, even if the husband later became impotent. The Church distinguished between temporary and permanent impotence. If the condition was considered temporary or curable, no annulment would be granted. But if deemed permanent, the marriage could be dissolved. This led to some creative defenses, with accused husbands claiming they were only impotent with their current wife due to witchcraft or curse, a condition that might not affect them with a different partner. Interestingly, impotence cases were brought by women at least as often as men, challenging our stereotypes about medieval gender roles. Court records show wives actively seeking sexual fulfillment and childbearing opportunities, not just passive acceptance of their marital fate. One woman in 15th century York complained her husband's member was scarcely longer or bigger than a small finger, making consummation impossible. Number 4. Non-consent. When you were forced to say, "I do." Did you know medieval marriage required freely given consent? Despite our images of arranged marriages and forced unions, the Church actually required both parties to consent to marriage for it to be valid. If you could prove you were forced to marry against your will, you had grounds for annulment. Pressure could come in many forms. Parents might threaten disinheritance, physical violence, or social ostracism to force a reluctant child into marriage. In noble families, political alliances often trumped personal preferences, with children sometimes betrothed before they could even speak. Women had slightly more protection under this rule than men, as the Church recognized they were more likely to be coerced. Young girls were particularly vulnerable, with some married off as young as 12, the minimum age the Church allowed for girls. Boys had to be 14. The famous case of Jeanne of France illustrates the complexity of consent claims. When Louis XII wanted to end their marriage in 1498, he claimed he had been forced into it by the previous king, Louis XI. Convenient timing, considering he wanted to marry Anne of Brittany instead. Despite Jeanne's protests, the annulment was granted. For common people, proving non-consent was challenging. You needed witnesses willing to testify that threats or coercion occurred, which could mean going against your own family. And even if you were initially forced, if you freely consummated the marriage afterward, the Church might consider you to have given subsequent consent, invalidating your claim. What's fascinating is that this focus on consent represented a progressive stance for its time. The Church was essentially saying that marriage should involve personal choice, not just family arrangements, even if the reality often fell short of the ideal. Number 3. Affinity. When you were connected by marriage rather than blood. Ever heard the phrase, kissing cousins? In medieval times, marriage created spiritual relationships that could be just as prohibitive as blood relationships. This concept, called affinity, meant you couldn't marry your in-laws or your godparents' children, among others. Affinity came in different types. The most common was created when you married someone. Suddenly, their entire family became off-limits to you if you were widowed. This created all sorts of complications in small communities where the pool of potential partners was already limited. But the truly wild part? Sexual relationships outside marriage could create affinity too. If a man had relations with a woman and later wanted to marry her sister, The Church said, "No way." The illicit relationship created affinity with the woman's entire family. Henry VIII famously used affinity in his quest to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, arguing that since she had been married to his brother Arthur, their marriage was forbidden by Leviticus. Despite having received a papal dispensation before the marriage, Henry later claimed this dispensation was invalid because some relationships were too sacred to be dispensed with. For ordinary people, affinity created practical problems. In one documented case, a woman whose husband had previously had a relationship with her cousin sought an annulment on affinity grounds. She wasn't trying to escape her marriage. She had just learned about the prior relationship and was genuinely concerned her marriage might be invalid in the eyes of God. The Church eventually relaxed some affinity restrictions because they created too many impediments to marriage in small communities. Still, affinity remained a convenient loophole for those looking to end an unwanted marriage throughout the medieval period. Number 2. Error of person. When your spouse wasn't who you thought they were. Have you ever been catfished? Medieval people experienced their own version of identity deception. Error of person referred to cases where someone married a person who fundamentally misrepresented themselves. This wasn't about being disappointed in your spouse's cooking skills. It involved basic identity. The classic scenario involved a proxy marriage, where the person who showed up wasn't the agreed-upon bride or groom. In aristocratic marriages, noble children might be betrothed without ever meeting. When they finally met on their wedding day, they might discover they'd been tricked into marrying someone else entirely. Error of person could also apply to cases of mistaken identity, such as when identical twins might be swapped. There's a documented case from 13th century France, where a man claimed he had contracted to marry one sister, but was tricked into marrying her identical twin instead. Status deception could sometimes qualify as well. If a free person unknowingly married a serf, a person bound to the land, they might have grounds for annulment, since servile status was considered fundamental to identity. Similarly, if someone claimed noble status falsely to secure a marriage, the deceived spouse might have recourse. What didn't count as error of person? Being lied to about your spouse's wealth, temperament, or virginity. The Church considered these qualities accidental rather than essential to personhood. Disappointment that your spouse wasn't as rich, kind, or pure as promised wasn't grounds for annulment. The difficulty in these cases was proving deception rather than mere disappointment. Medieval courts were surprisingly sophisticated in distinguishing between fundamental identity issues and mere buyer's remorse after making a poor marital choice. Number 1. Clandestine marriage. When you didn't follow the rules. Did you know you could get married in medieval times without a priest, witnesses, or even telling your parents? It's true. All you needed was to exchange words of present consent, take you as my husband, wife, and you were legally married in the eyes of the Church. But these clandestine marriages became a major headache for medieval society. Parents hated clandestine marriages because they undermined family control over marriage alliances. The Church disliked them because they were difficult to prove and led to individuals claiming to be married to multiple people. Local communities were suspicious of them because marriage was supposed to be a public affair with community approval. Despite disapproval, clandestine marriages were technically valid until the Council of Trent in 1563, which finally required a priest and witnesses for a valid Catholic marriage. Before that, a marriage made secretly was still binding, even if it was against the rules. The secret nature of these marriages made them grounds for both forming and breaking marital bonds. A person might claim a secret marriage existed to force someone who had promised marriage after seduction to follow through. Conversely, someone unhappily married in public might claim a prior secret marriage to someone else, making their current public marriage invalid. Court records show endless disputes over alleged secret marriages. In one famous case from 15th century London, a woman named Agnes Whitington claimed she had secretly married John Ely before witnesses. John denied this and said he was now married to another woman. The court had to determine which marriage was valid based on conflicting testimony about words exchanged in private years earlier. For nobles and royals, the ability to claim or deny clandestine marriages created both problems and opportunities. King Edward IV of England secretly married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, creating a scandal when it was revealed later. The lack of witnesses made such unions both convenient and contestable. The ambiguity of clandestine marriages made them the perfect tool for both creating and dissolving marital bonds, depending on what someone needed to achieve. They represent perhaps the most flexible and therefore most abused category of medieval marriage law. So the next time you think divorce is complicated today, remember medieval couples navigating the labyrinth of annulment grounds. Were they genuinely seeking to correct invalid marriages or just finding creative loopholes to escape unwanted unions? And why did the Church create a system with so many escape hatches while officially prohibiting divorce? Could there be more to medieval marriage than meets the modern eye?